The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand, and we gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise, to get what we want, we got to organize.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Pantsula Podcast, brought to you by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. For those of you who are not familiar with the A-APRP, our objective is Pan-Africanism, which means the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. As you can see here, I'm here with my comrade Evan, and today we have a special guest, someone who I call the GOAT, greatest of all time, Dr. CBS will be with us. So we're definitely going to have a fruitful conversation, speaking on, especially during, the Pan-African Women's Day is coming up. So we definitely going to be speaking on topics on that, talking about Pan-Africanism in general, and other topics as well. So as you guys know, every episode we like to dedicate to our ancestors, two of our ancestors. So before we get started, I'll pass it to my comrade Evan, who's going to tap in and lay out who the ancestors we dedicate this episode to.
All right, so for this episode, we're gonna dedicate this to Pat Parker and Grace Campbell. Pat Parker was born Patricia Cooks. She was a poet, an activist. She had involvement with the Black Panther Party and Black Women's Revolutionary Council. And one of the things she did work not only with African liberation, also and feminism, and also work with gay, lesbian communities against domestic violence. And one thing I noticed that she also had literary exchanges with Audre Lorde. People might be a lot more familiar with Audre Lorde, but might not be as familiar with Pat Parker. So we want to honor her. And sometimes when people they know certain names of our ancestors, but there are other people who are involved in the work that might not get the same kind of lift up. So that's one name that we want to honor, and especially relevant for our conversation today is Grace Campbell, Grace P. Campbell, who was a co-founder of the African Blood Brotherhood. She was also a member of the Socialist Party and the Communist Party of America. And again, in regards to the African Blood Brotherhood, people might not know much about the African Blood Brotherhood, but if they do, they might be more familiar with the name Cyril Briggs. Again, she was involved with a lot of the work there, and she even ran for a New York State Assembly in 1918 and 1920. And to dovetail it into the conversation we have Dr. CBS, Dr. Charisse Burden Stelly, and she can give more detailed information about herself and on the work she does.
Hey, y'all. So Ashe to the ancestors. And thank you both for having me here. Hey, y'all, I just found out that this guy right here is Jazzy Jeff, Jazzy Archives, one of my favorite Instagram accounts, all the heat, all the books. So and then Evan, a dope scholar, thinker. So I'm really glad to be here. As they said, my name is Charisse Burden Stelly, or CBS, Dr. CBS. I am an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University. My work is broadly at the intersection of the tradition of radical Blackness and state repression, specifically as it's manifested through anti-communism in the 20th century. My work, it's critical Black studies, but it's also political theory, intellectual history, political economy. And I co-authored a book with Gerald Horne, W.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, currently finishing up one manuscript called Black Scare, Red Scare, about to start another one. And then I have a couple edited volumes coming out this year, one which we'll talk about today, Organized Fight Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writing with Dr. Jody Dean, and then Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Post-Colonial State, which is co-authored with Percy Henson and Aaron Kamogisha. I am also the co-coordinator of the Research and Political Education team of the Black Alliance for Peace and a member of the coordinating committee.
Awesome. So again, great to have you here. So we have a few questions sent through to you before. And first one is, just talk about one of the first times that I got familiar with your work was a 2017 piece in Black Agenda Report entitled "Why Claudia Jones Will Always Be More Relevant Than Ta-Nehisi Coates." And I know that while you work that Claudia Jones has been like the focal point. And two points. One, how does Jones's analysis help Africans organizing for communism, for Pan-Africanism? And also, what are some conclusions that you come to since writing that piece that would explain the growth in your scholarly work?
Yeah, I had to like look that piece up. I forgot I wrote that. But that, it's actually a really, really important piece. That's actually when I first met Glenn Ford, RIP, who I love dearly and who was one of my great heroes. And that was my first, I think, outward facing piece. And it's very, I think in many ways, it's very reflective of where I was at that time in terms of that was my like very heavy academic battle rap mode. Like anybody could get it. It was smoke, period. But I actually, and also, that focus on Claudia Jones really came out of my dissertation. In one of my chapters, I wrote about her experience of deportation through, at that time, the framework was that I was using is anti-communism, anti-radicalism, anti-Blackness. So it was very clunky. And so part of that particular piece was a critique of Ta-Nehisi Coates's, he had an essay called "The First White President," which I thought was trash. And that piece also reflects, I was really working through my critique of Afro-pessimism at that time, specifically the ontological and metaphysical character of Afro-pessimism. And Coates, to me, is, even if he doesn't cite them, the way that he approaches questions of race is very much in conversation with Afro-pessimism. And so part of what I was critiquing about Coates is his sort of metaphysical and transhistorical approach to race and whiteness in a way that I felt was emptied race as an analytical category of any historical and contextual specificity. And so I counterposed him to Claudia Jones because she also had a critique of racism, but as a sort of function of imperialism and of capitalist exploitation. And not to say that racism was reducible to those things, because into the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, she says that the Negro question is prior to the woman question, meaning especially that in the context of the United States, racism was a category through which other ascriptive categories were understood as relates to Black people. And so I think Claudia Jones is important because she was working class, right? She was somebody who was actually in the working class, and that she was an immigrant to the United States. She was a communist and she was Black. And so she was all of the categories that the US really despises. And the fact that she was working class is important because a lot of the people who ascended to kind of leadership in the Communist Party, especially Black folks, were petty bourgeois, but committed class suicide. But she was actually working class. And in fact, she had a heart condition her entire life from working in a factory at a young age. She's also important because she was a journalist. And so I think that her writing style was very accessible because she was a journalist, but she also was a theorist. So she had a number of publications in Political Affairs, which was a theoretical journal. It started out as The Communist, but then became Political Affairs, which was a theoretical journal of the CPUSA. And so she was driving a lot of the theory that pertained not only to Black women, but also to understanding imperialism and peace. And so much of my own politics, I think I learned from Claudia Jones, updated to our current historical moment, right? But so much of what I know and how I understand race, sex, so not necessarily gender, but sex, as a particular category of surplus value extraction, as a particular relationship to the mode of production. And imperialism comes from Claudia Jones. And also, what I know about state repression, because she wrote about state repression from her own experience of deportation, but also from the experience of her comrades like Ben Davis, like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, like William Patterson. And so the things that I care about in my own work, I think Claudia Jones, learning about Claudia Jones and then reading her own work helped to draw those things out. And in terms of that piece where I was then in terms of where I am now, when I reread it, I was like, that's bars. It actually is really good. I like it. But I think that the tone is a little bit more harsh than I would take now, not because it's incorrect, but I think that just as there are input seasons and there are output seasons, as Zora Neale Hurston says, there are years that are questions and years that give answers. And I think that likewise, there are modes, there are times for sort of really trenchant critique, and then there are times for more a more focus on synthesis or unity. And I think that that's sort of where I am now is, I'm still very, very critical. It's just part of my nature. I'm a Taurus and I hate everything and I'm a curmudgeon. So it's very much a part of who I am. But I think that I'm also things are really, really bad right now. And so because we need all hands on deck, I feel like I have to take an approach where I'm trying to see what the different ideological orientations have to offer. Not liberalism. I still gotta pray on that. But anarchism, Trotskyism, those political orientations that are not my own, but I think that are can still be useful, right? And that I'm really trying to take seriously that there's a difference between enemies and those with whom we deeply disagree. And so I think that now is not the time for sectarianism and doing pig work or doing the government's work for them. Now is a time of doing work for the people, which means sort of closing ranks in a particular way. So, yeah.
Yeah. One question, this may just be a personal one, but still for the broader audience that I have is how did you get to where you got to now, politically? What took place in your life to get you? And then just in relation to this episode, were there any women, whether personally in your life or women revolutionary women that you've studied that helped your political growth and trajectory?
Well, I came to consciousness through books and through study. I'm an academic and I am part of an organization now, and I'm a fledgling organizer. I still don't identify as an organizer. Because I'm still learning. And, because I just think that it means something to identify in that way. And I think we don't take that seriously enough, what it actually means to be an organizer versus an activist versus a mobilizer, right? But so I came to consciousness through books and through study, and like a lot of sort of Black radicals I know, I went through, I came to consciousness through Afrocentrism. And Africana womanism. And that's the sort of, that at that time I went through my white purge, I went natural for the first time and all that, I really, really loved John Henrik Clarke and studied his work. A Great and Mighty Walk is still my favorite movie to this day. I read, the Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, all the classics, I hit all the classics. And then, as I started, I would say probably reading more about the Black Panther Party I started thinking more about like Marxism. And then in graduate school, at one point I was going to be a development economist. And so I was reading a lot of Marxist, Caribbean Marxists in particular. So like Lloyd Best, Clive Thomas, of course, Walter Rodney. And so that sort of pivoted me to where I am now. But in terms of probably, there's this book by Clenora Hudson Weems called Africana Womanism that actually was very extraordinarily formative to thinking about gender. And I don't share that gender perspective now, the whole complementarity thing. That's probably not where I am now. But as an undergraduate, I wrote my honors thesis on feminist and womanist trends in the Black and the civil rights and Black power movement. And so I was reading like Afeni Shakur's biography, it was more of a conversation with Jasmine Guy, A Taste of Power, the classics, right? A Taste of Power, Asada, and the Angela Davis's autobiography. So those were the main texts that I was reading. And so I think that those texts were really formative to like my political and ideological development. And then once in graduate school, I really started doing much more historical research. And that's when I started reading a lot of the primary texts. And then, reading the work of Gerald Horne really got me focused and thinking about like the Communist Party USA in particular, and then the Communist Party, the Communist movement writ large. So, and it wasn't until relatively recently that I joined an organization. I think we'll talk a little bit later about Black Alliance for Peace, but there just came a point where I was like, okay, I need to join an organization. So, but a lot of my consciousness came just, through reading and through studying what made the most sense to me. So, yeah.
Got you. And speaking of the point, when you asked my last question, you did a sort of a distinction of like sex and gender, and I'll get to it in this question about, I know we were talking about your book, Organize, Fight, Win, like communist women's political writing, and on your website, you mentioned the need to account for Black women as leaders against triple oppression they face, and you also mentioned some women, but were there other like communists or Pan-Africanists in the midst of writing your book that could help organizers or even like militant academics to understand the material conditions we're facing, and also how can we expand this to for the oppression of gender oppressed Africans, so people non-binary or trans or fall within the gender binary.
Mm-hmm. Well, so starting with Organize, Fight, Win. So I just want to sort of mention the women that are profiled in that particular text, just because some are going to be familiar, some not. So there's Ella Baker, Carlotta Bass, Dorothy Burnham, who's still alive, Williana Burroughs, Grace P. Campbell, Alice Childress, Marvell Cook, Esther Cooper Jackson, Thelma Dale Perkins, Tyra Edwards, Vicki Garvin, Yvonne Gregory, Lorraine Hansberry, Dorothy Hunton, Claudia Jones, Maud White Katz, LTP or Louise Thompson Patterson, and Eslanda Good Robeson. And so most of these women were in the Communist Party, but some were just adjacent, like Carlotta Bass, Dorothy Hunton, Ella Baker. They weren't in the Communist Party, but they were certainly anti-capitalist and were sort of doing work around or with people who were in the Communist Party. So we in the book, we call it like communist and communist adjacent women. And I think, so one of the sort of big contributions of people like Louise Thompson Patterson and Grace Campbell very early on, and Claudia Jones, is this idea of triple oppression. Now, Grace Campbell wrote about double, and sometimes I say triple oppression, sometimes it's triple exploitation. And I've sort of been trying to really look at it analytically and see if there are distinctions or when one is used over the other. But anyway, Grace Campbell early on, and I want to say 1921 maybe, talked about double oppression, but she was taken as a given that women were workers. So she was talking about how Black women workers were oppressed as women and were oppressed as workers. And this idea or this framework of triple oppression is important because it pushed the Communist Party to rethink or to expand like the category of the worker and to look at the intersection of oppression and exploitation. Because if you only look at the white working class, you only get if you only look at the white male factory worker, for example, you get a very sort of narrow understanding of the nature of work. And so what they're arguing is that if you look at the condition of Black women, there are so many forms of domination that accrue around them because of the type of work that in which they engage, which was largely up until really like 1960, like sharecropping or agricultural work and domestic labor. And domestic labor in particular. So Esther Cooper Jackson writes her dissertation about, in 1940s, she writes her dissertation about Black domestic workers and ultimately the need to unionize them because they're the most exploited workers because they don't have at that time, right? There was, so the New Deal is popping off and there's like different types of like, this is when Social Security and unemployment and other types of workers' protections are being codified in law, but Black women did not qualify for them because their work was flexibilized, it was piecemeal, it was part-time. Oftentimes they'll be paid in kind and not wages. So which means that like these white women would give them like clothes and a pot roast or some shit instead of wages.
It's like today.
Right. And even, and then there's like the social oppression, right? So, which also, so Claudia Jones in the Ends and the Neglect talked about like, even in the party, like white men wouldn't want to dance with Black women. And the forms of sort of social oppression and ostracism that come with those intersections, like race, sex, and class. And so I think triple oppression is really important because it helps us think about how what I call, particular relationships to the capitalist mode of production produce different forms of domination, which is different than intersectionality. So part of what we write about in the introduction is that triple oppression was really an analysis of capitalism and imperialism. Intersectionality can do that work maybe, and some people use intersectionality to do that work, but that was not the theoretical basis of intersectionality. The theoretical basis of intersectionality was recognition before the law. I'm not saying one is good or bad, but these are different political genealogies. These are different, there's different so what's, right? And so I think revisiting triple oppression is important for that reason, because capitalism and imperialism are sort of central to that analysis, and building organizations is central to that analysis, because the other thing that Claudia Jones and others were arguing was that, Black women are some of the most militant workers precisely because of their material realities. And so to forego organizing domestic workers, to continue to have a party or an organization that is hostile to Black women or that does not think about them at all, that doesn't recognize a special character of their oppression and exploitation, cannot fully challenge imperialism, right? It is not harnessing some of the most potentially revolutionary people, right? And again, I think that's just a different analysis than intersectionality. Period. Again, right, wrong, or indifferent. And so I guess my question, you asked about oppressed genders. And I just wonder if you could say more about that. There's the terminology of oppressed genders, and then there's marginalized genders. And I just, because I'm a theorist, like words matter. And so I wonder what if you see like a distinction between like marginalized genders and oppressed genders. And so just start with that question.
All right, so I know that like people that one, especially within our party, like one thing we're trying to do is get a much more expansive view of the relationship between gender and as far as the building Pan-Africanism. I think some of it, like when you saw gender oppression, is it's more of a personal choice. Like I don't know, something about like, it's not that I don't like the term marginalized genders, but I do think that like understanding that there is a repression, like specifically with regards to either their gender themselves or from the basis of gender. I think that's, I don't know if I answer the question. Because I remember reading some of the works of Butch Lee, of works from Night Vision, and also the rebiography of Harriet Tubman. She uses like gender oppression, and I don't know, something about that as far as like understanding how like capitalism and like patriarchy work in concert with each other, like that feels. I don't know if it gets to, like more to the root of the issue, I guess. Like sort of, I'm not saying that marginalized genders doesn't, but honestly, something about that might like sort of like, oh, someone's marginalized. Oh, let's have an inclusive, like, but inclusive in what? Or whereas with like gender press was like, yeah, like the gender press, and we want to end that oppression. That answers the question.
Well, I mean, I think so. I don't really like to extrapolate into the past. And so I think that there are many sort of gender oppressed persons. I think that I'm interested in sort of how they are thinking with or like taking up this work, because I can't speak to how it should be applied, right? Because I think that it's the same way, I guess perhaps it's similar to the ways that U.S. racial analysis can't be extrapolated throughout the world, because racial formations are different and racial realities are different depending on where you are. And so I think methodologically, these type of works that are focusing on sex particularly can be useful. That is to say, what are the forms, how does oppression or exploitation manifest, right, among oppressed genders, right? So what are the ways that they manifest? What are the material realities of them, right? And then what are the ways historically that these groups have struggled for liberation? And so I think that there, in that regard, there's a lot to learn from people like Claudia Jones and Louise Thompson Patterson and Grace Campbell and Esther Cooper Jackson. I think that what we have to be really, really careful of is because of the time and context in which gender and sexuality became mainstreamed as a politic. Well, not necessarily gender, but gender in the way that we understand it now, right? Gender as opposed to sex, that it can get very entrapped in liberal forms of struggle or like or abstract claims. And so I'm trying to speak carefully because I'm trying to speak carefully. But like, so I think that it's really, really, that is where the work of like dialectical materialists really come into play, right? And so that is what I think that the work about women or the work about sexual oppression, how that work can be brought to bear on other genders.
Yeah, I know you alluded to it earlier, but more so want to kind of get into how you got into the Black Alliance for Peace. Like, how did you get into the organizer space? I know you don't call yourself an organizer per se, but to kind of talk about that and probably how do you see yourself in the work you do tying in with the legacies of some of the revolutionary African women that you mentioned, and probably further in those legacies as well?
Mm-hmm. Well, I joined the Black Alliance for Peace in 2020. And 2020 was in many ways like a really magical time. Like I can only like, especially like early 2020, it was just a really magical time that was like beacon with possibility. And a lot of that got shut down very quickly. But I really think it was and a lot of things have moved online at that time. And so I think, like in 2019 or 2018, I had written about the Black Alliance for Peace. And so I was familiar with Black Alliance for Peace, especially through like reading Black Agenda Report and just kind of following the work that they were doing. But it just felt like, and I can't remember if it was Erica Keynes or Jemima Pierre that sort of recruited me to Black Alliance for Peace. I can't exactly remember. I know that it was Jemima that suggested that I join. I wanted to get more involved, right? And she suggested that I join it was the research team at the time. Now it's the research and political education team. But and a lot of my work in Black Alliance for Peace has been virtual, right? We did in 2021, we were doing a lot of work around Haiti. And so there were a couple of protests here in Chicago, or a couple of rallies that we organized in solidarity with the strikes that were happening at that time. Recently, we were doing work at the People's Summit in LA. But a lot of that work has been virtual, and a lot of it has been around sort of research and political education. It's what I do in the org. But I would say there's even reading what I wrote in 2017 and the way that I think and write now is I think really different, because I think about my audience differently. I really didn't think about audience, and I still kind of don't think about audience as much, but I think there's a clarity in my writing now and a striving to be clear in a way that I didn't necessarily have previously. Because I don't know that academia, it certainly doesn't train you, but it also doesn't encourage you to necessarily write clearly. And there can also be a way that writing for a broader audience can be seen as sort of like not intellectual or something. I think joining Black Alliance for Peace has strengthened my internationalism. I think that I knew a lot about internationalism sort of in theory and also historically, but like there's more of a practice of internationalism, if only through sort of the way that we pay deep attention to what's happening in the Caribbean, in Africa, among Africans, wherever they are, and connecting it to what's happening here, right? And connecting it to sort of US imperialism. And so I think Black Alliance for Peace has definitely helped me with political education, and with like deepening my internationalist and Pan-Africanist consciousness. And I would say I have had to work on my revolutionary patience a lot, because I am not patient. I am not friendly. And I still am not particularly friendly, but I do think because like, I want us to win. No, I want Black people to win, not like I'm rooting for all Black people, but I want oppressed people, workers to win. There is a sort of a comradeship that has to be demonstrated. And so I think that I've become more comradely for sure. And it's also encouraged me to think more expansively about intellectuals. I never had the conception that intellectuals, like only people with degrees had intellectuals. Because if I look at something like John Henrik Clarke, so many of the people I sort of respect and love are autodidactic, but there's still sort of maybe an elitism, because John Henrik Clarke is one of one, right? There's nobody really like him. There's nobody really like Du Bois. Du Bois, of course, does have degrees or whatever. But then there's people who don't necessarily publish. right? They don't necessarily, or they might publish in popular media, but those are the people I learn like the most from, right? So somebody like Erica Keynes has been one of my most important teachers. We call her the radicalizer in chief, because I feel like most people, like me, so many people have come to Black Alliance for Peace or have moved to the left because of her. Somebody like Dev Springer, so they're not in BAT, but they have done so much around through podcasting, art, culture work, all sorts of things. So these are people that I really learn from. And I think being in an organization collapses hierarchies that academia encourages, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, another way is like as far as like organizes, like reading some of the stuff from, especially with our work study, reading stuff from of elders and ancestors who are in prison, and even now, like reading stuff from like in prison intellectuals is very illuminating. And I think that's for anyone, like if you want like some people who like they get the sort of like the raw, especially here the snakes, like the raw fascism of it, like reads and stuff like the Jackie's Hills, the Mumia, Jamals, and so forth. That they got it from that. And speaking of internationalism, this goes back to when you had a class visit to my class a few months ago. So just let everyone know that that CBS during my spring semester in school, I took a history class with Dr. Natanya Duncan, and she invited numerous Black women scholars to come in, and one of them was Dr. CBS. And one of the things that we brought up was about what you discussed was Black internationalism. And I don't know if I don't remember if I asked a question about it, or like you specified about like the difference between Black internationalism and Pan-Africanism. There's one thing for the A-APRP that we have a specific definition is the total liberation of Africa under scientific socialism. And I'm saying that one of the primary bits of that ideology of humanitarianism is the primacy of Africa. And just how, so first explain some of the difference between that Black international and Pan-Africanism that you have, as well as discussing how crucial Black African women have been to Black internationalism.
Yeah, so there's some debate about Black internationalism. So for example, Hakeem Adi just came out with a book about Pan-Africanism, and he basically argues that Black internationalism is really not a historical reality. Jane, I think it's Jane Nerdal, she was a French Pan-Africanist basically, but she had the term internationalisme noir. It's French. I know that was not how it's pronounced, but it's basically Black internationalism. But that what he said was that basically US Black scholars began to use this term Black internationalism. And for him, it was simply a way to like move away from Pan-Africanism. I don't share that perspective. So I think for me, when I talk about Black internationalism, I talk about it as basically the revolutionary wing of Pan-Africanism. Because for me, Pan-Africanism is ideologically ecumenical, right? It runs the gamut from communist to more conservative, right? Because I think Marcus Garvey is a Pan-Africanist. He's not a socialist or a communist in any way. And so when I talk about, for me, Black internationalism is a conceptual framework to think about the intersection of Pan-Africanism and then kind of like internationalist socialism and communism. So that's how I use it. Black internationalism is basically like, and it's also the Black wing of third worldism and tricontinentalism that like popped off in like the 60s, the 60s and 70s. So that's how I understand Black internationalism. That's how I operationalize it. Gerald Horne and I wrote a piece in the Handbook of Pan-Africanism laying this out, right? It's also a temporal difference because like the seeds of Black internationalism are planted in the interwar period, but then they sort of flourish post-World War II. There's a much longer history of Pan-Africanism dating back to the 1800s. And then most people who think about Pan-Africanism see it as starting in the diaspora and then moving to the continent. Like that tends to be the sort of the temporality of it. And so, you know, there are a number of women who were, and I also think, you know, according to the A-APRP, like Africa is primary. I don't know that. I think Africa is absolutely essential in Black internationalism. I don't know that it's primary in the way that it is for the A-APRP. So there are women, so somebody like Claudia Jones, she didn't write a whole lot about Africa, but she's certainly an internationalist, and she certainly understood the importance of African liberation, right? And decolonization, decoloniality, not least because of her reality as a Caribbean, you know, a Trinidadian. And so I think that might also be like another difference. There are a lot of Pan-Africanists that I think are really, or Black, you know, Black women Pan-Africanists or Black internationalists that are really important. There's Eslanda Good Robeson. There is Queen Mother Moore, right? So Queen Mother Moore is probably, Ashley Farmer is actually coming out with a wonderful biography of Queen Mother Moore, who is also the foundation of the reparations movement. So she's very important in terms of reparations, and she was a nationalist, but she was a Pan-Africanist, and so and that is reflected in her understanding of reparations. There's Vicky Garvin, who was in Ghana and Nigeria for a while after she was, you know, basically in exile before she went to China. Shirley Graham Du Bois. And then you have, and so I must admit, I'm much more conversant in sort of people who were in the United States or people who are African-American, but of course there's like Winnie Mandela. There is Ndaye, who is a Guyanese scholar. Patricia Rodney, I would certainly count as a Pan-Africanist. And so I think that what's important about these women, not everybody wrote a lot, but I think it's their practice, right? So they were, Amy Ashwood Garvey as well. So they were at some of these conferences. They were helping to organize some of these Pan-African congresses and conferences. They were linking up. What a lot of Pan-African women did was link up with other Black women's or African women's organizations, right? And they did a lot of advocacy and mutual aid. And mutual aid, in the way that I understand it, the way that mutual aid is used today, I don't understand what the mutual in that form of mutual aid is, but these women were definitely building networks and were reciprocating resources, intellectual resources, as well as sort of monetary resources. They were strategizing together and doing those sorts of things. And so that's what I mean by mutual aid. Alongside the sort of monetary resources, there was a reciprocity to it. And so I think that we don't know the names of a lot of the Black women internationalists and Pan-Africanist women. And I think that's okay. Like, I think that there's a way that when people achieve a particular level of notoriety, like somebody like Claudia Jones, there's a way that they become everything and nothing. And we've seen it happen with Malcolm X. We've seen it happen with Marcus Garvey. We've seen it happen with Du Bois and so many other people. And so I think it's okay that we don't know the names of people. And in some ways, people who were less sort of nameless faces, people of movements, are often the people that lived, you know? And I think it's okay that we don't know individual names as long as we realize that those are the people who sustain these movements, right? That we have to look at organizations and we have to look at the mass characters where it's at, not these exceptional Negroes, wherever they're located, that really sustain these movements. And that the ability to travel to different places, there's a class basis to that, right? There's a class basis to that understanding of Pan-Africanism. And this is where you get people like Beyonce. I think it was fucking sorry. I think it was Terrence Howard. This is where the celebrities try to use the language or the aesthetics or the valence of Pan-Africanism. Akon, even old boy that went to play basketball. So if we don't understand the sort of class character of the people who actually can return and the people who can move around, and we don't analyze that, I think we can get a very distorted conception of how Pan-Africanism actually works. Because some of the most Pan-Africanists were also the people who are supporting revolutionary movements in Southern Africa, in Asia, in the Caribbean. These are some of the most important Pan-Africanists. Some of them were at the large gatherings. Many of them were at the large gatherings. Some of the more prominent guerrillas, some weren't, right? But they're still building connections. They're still building together. It's the practice of Pan-Africanism. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but that was just a lot of me saying things.
Yeah, I know a lot of the stuff you've been talking about, just like on social media, and I think maybe even the stuff you've been writing more so has been centered around organizing. Is it your experience in BAP that made you realize the importance of it, or is it something else that's been influencing you to kind of push the line for people to join an organization and just organize completely?
I think that sort of in my study, even prior to me joining an organization and getting on social media, I studied organizations or people, and I noticed that people are in organizations. Du Bois was always in an organization. Claudia Jones was in an organization. Malcolm X was in an organization. Assata Shakur was in an organization. Angela Davis was in an organization. Alpheus Hunton was in an organization, and everybody's in an organization. And all these organizations have newspapers. So that's important too, because that's a sort of a consciousness raising arm, right? And so understanding that praxis just gave me the sense of the importance of organizations. But I think that part of why I started really beating that drum is because of social media. There's a weird aversion to joining an organization. And I get it to a certain degree, because if you listen to my very early podcast, like 2017, 2018, I would talk about like, I'm not an organization, I'm an academic or whatever. And then I know that for myself, I'll have a lot of excuses as to why, I was not in an organization until I joined an organization and see how very important it is, right? And it's not only joining an organization, it's contributing to that organization. It's participating in that organization. And to be sure, people's critique, there's a lot of stuff out there, especially about left-wing organizations, that can deter folks, right? But there's this idea that because there's contradictions in an organization, that's reason enough not to join. But like I said, I've said before, just as there are no perfect revolutionaries, there's no perfect organizations. We are in a settler, colonial, racial, capitalist society. So the contradictions inherent in that are going to permeate every institution and every structure. And the point is to struggle against that, right? The point is to fashion the organization into what it strives to be through those forms of struggle. And it's not easy, right? And especially even with the pandemic, right? Like a lot of people, there's a lot of sort of issues with like getting back to in-person stuff. But we have to get back, we have to do things in person. We have to like be, and it's not be in the streets, because mobilization is not organizing. It's important, and it can be a form of consciousness raising. It can't, and a lot of people through their participation, for example, in the George Floyd protests, became radicalized and did join organizations and et cetera. And there are organized aspects. There are people who are organized that go to actions, but that's not to say that mobilization is organizing, whatever. So I think that seemed like the discourse on social media, so to speak, and then the weird usages of like mutual aid, the anti-intellectualism. So people like getting mad at reading, so I made a joke when I had my podcast about like, we're the literates. They think we're literates. Like, how dare we tell people to read a book, you know what I mean? Or to study collectively. And so I think, to me, to even just develop a collective consciousness is so incredibly important, because liberal individualism is so ubiquitous. And as people, you know, like Onye and Erica, we talk about, we're in a world where ideas, right? This is the phase in terms of struggle over ideas, and the way to guard against that, right? The way to sort of be rooted in your principles is by being with comrades, is by joining an organization. And you know, there's something to be said about forming your own organization, but I'm ambivalent about that. I think that we have too many 10 people organizations. At some point, we got to build a mass organization, and being more and more segmented, I don't think is necessarily the way to get there. So I think struggling in established organizations is probably the way to go at this point.
And I think there's certainly an aspect to it that, oh, sorry, like the fan just like sucked the air out of me, sorry. But and it certainly understands like, some of the versions of some organizations, like we, for example, we talked about women in the Black women in the Communist Party, and because we know the Communist Party USA has certainly had, so let's just say, quite a few contradictions the last while. Not only as big, but certainly now, and there's certainly other organizations that have not just like issues over the line, but also like so that like anti-people's and also like understanding how like making sure that you talk about like we don't like 10 organizations like sort of having that balance between of people organizing, and also making sure that when the organized, it's not just the same type of people that you know in your group, and like they have nothing, like if you look at the guy or people you walk down the street with or neighbors with that they don't know what the organization is doing. I think that's something that I think certainly I think some people, I think it's on social media, like some people try to say that, but yeah, it also gets to the point where people do the don't read or like stuff that's just like this is like some of the stuff that I understand, like when the government's like getting on you for rent stuff, that yeah, you like obviously it's an issue, and I know even though we have critiques of sort of like the middle class like movements with like the personal is political, and I think that understanding that is an aspect to that. And oh wait, we can get to that. So we just get back to the question about like how do we make sure that all this like the intellectual work we're doing, and that we apply that practices, so that especially like, super exploited like Black women are not left out, that when we're doing this study, that it's not just to press like other people who happen to be just go to the same universities or if in that circle, that the people that others in your family or in your neighborhood, so forth, that they are a part of it, and how we make sure that we're doing the social revolution and fighting for the stuff that these elders and ancestors find, that we don't get taken up by, say, opportunism or any sort of like anti-people's behavior. Hope that like correctly.
Yeah, so there was a lot there. Well, I think that I'm just very I do think that we need to read and study Black women revolutionaries, not because they're Black women, but because they were revolutionaries, because they were literally contributing through theory, through organizing, through day-to-day work to revolutionary struggle. And so I'm very weary of the identitarian way that, like, for example, cite Black women can be taken up. Because, for example, like, part of my training is in political economy. There's not a lot of women political economists, period, and certainly not a lot of left wing. And so if I'm only focused on citing women, I'm not going to be able to do my work well. I think that what is important is recognizing, is thinking about, like, why is it that there are not a whole lot of Black leftist women political economists? There's a whole reason behind that, but also sort of how am I thinking and trying to expand the things that I'm reading and that I'm citing to understand the material conditions of Black women, of oppressed people in general, right? And so I think we've come to a little bit of a period of overcorrection where sometimes we're not very critical when we're trying to sort of be inclusive, right? Or we're trying to sort of correct past mistakes rooted in sort of patriarchy and sexism, when we're not being critical enough in our calls. So, there's no body that makes you objectively revolutionary or your ideas objectively good, right? Or useful. And in fact, because of how neoliberal multiculturalism works, in fact, more and more Black women, Black people, racialized people and women are being the caretakers of empire. They're being incorporated. They're essential to reproducing imperialism and capitalism with the so-called human face. Like, they are integral to that, right? And so I think it's like, what Black women are we citing and holding up? Like, who are we learning from? And are we taking them? Are we just regurgitating their ideas to demonstrate mastery? Or are we actually studying them, critiquing them, wherever they fall short, right? Applying them, expanding them, and thinking and taking them seriously as thinkers, which means that they're not on a pedestal, right? Because nothing is above critique and nobody is above critique. And so I think that that's sort of how we need to think about it, and not sort of be so, and not fall into identity reductionism, which I think is extraordinarily harmful and is very like rampant right now, right? And it allows for us to get robbed and tricked and hustled by people just because they look like us. Yeah, I don't want to get robbed by somebody that looks like me, just like I don't want to get robbed by no white. So we have to be vigilant about that.
Right. It sounds like, it sounds, because I hear so often the whole Marxism is white, communism is white, anarchism is white, socialism is white, or feminism is white, like all that, or it's a male thing, white male thing, and it's just like, it's like, stop. Like, yeah, there are certainly like political, social praxis that don't fall on them. Like, that's not. I certainly agree with that point, but certainly there's sort of like dismissal of things that have brought benefits to like billions of people. Just dismiss it. That's a whole different story, and I agree with that.
Mm-hmm. I think that we have to be there. We have to ask ourselves a question: why is it that so many African and Caribbean and new African revolutionaries engaged with some type of scientific socialism? Whether it's Marxism, Leninism, whether it's Maoism, right? Whether it's Stalinism, tanky shit like me, right? And why is it that was so central to their ideological development, right? And Nkrumah Tureism is a particular enunciation of scientific socialism. What I would call Rodneyism, I identify as a Rodneyist, is a particular articulation of scientific socialism. Cabralism, right? So these things, I think, as Fanon said, that Marxism needs to be stretched when it comes to the colonial question. And our people understood that. Like, duh, like for Black people, even in the CPUSA, everybody knew the Negro question was important and was central, right? The thing about being in a party, though, is party discipline is a thing. And in a party, you debate things and sometimes you lose. But you keep, but those struggles are ongoing, and to call Marxism a European thing because Karl Marx's locus of enunciation was Europe, is to completely disregard all of the Black people and all of the global South people, especially after like 1950, who made Marxism relevant, like actually existing scientific socialism relevant. It just, to me, it's very goofy. And I think it's a way in our, like, anti-communism is so endemic in our society that's an easy way for people to sit in their ignorance, is to just say, oh, that's white people stuff. And yet it's like, you believe in democracy. You believe in white Jesus. And yet, but somehow but Marxism, that's where you draw the line. Like it's goofball Jamal stuff. And I don't take that very seriously. And mind you, I came to scientific socialism through Black people. It was way later that I was reading Lenin and Marx and Bukharin and all these other folks. Like that was way later. Like I came to Marxism through Black people. So, and I'm Black, and I'm not only like, I'm a race woman. Like I am, like I'm a Hotep Marxist, right? So like I will, and even when I don't agree with it or I'm critical of it, I take all of our stuff seriously. Even the ADO stuff. It's not that, and again, it's not that I condone it, but we have to ask ourselves, why is it that ADOS is so popular among working class Black people? And we can't just say it's because of the CIA. The CIA ain't going to the hood. Like the CIA is doing a lot of work on social media, let's be clear. But I think that nationalism has always stuck with our people. It's been the hegemonic, it has been the overarching and hegemonic framework for US Black people. And so we can't simply just ignore it. We have to take it seriously, right? And make our ideas, our Pan-Africanist ideas, our socialist ideas equally accessible and palatable to the people, right? Anarchism is not my bag, right? I don't know enough about, I will say I don't know enough about it. And so I don't have much to say, but I'm reading it. I'm reading Irvin. I'm reading, I have a whole stack of the books. There's a lot of them. Zoe, I think, Zoe Samudzi? They have that book. There's like a green book. So I literally have a whole stack of books. Couple white, mostly Black folks who are writing about anarchism because it seems to be really resonating with folks, right? With Black people, with our people. And I love Black people. I take us seriously. And I know that even liberals, even some conservatives are very much concerned with like how to get free. Do I agree with their conception of freedom? Absolutely not. Because for some people it's freedom of the market. And it's like you don't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of, but you're a free market. Like get out of here. But I do think that we have to take, like, ignorance is no excuse. We have to take these things seriously if we're trying to build a mass base, right? So.
Yeah, I think what's important too that you kind of laid out is interrogating and reading the sources, even if you don't agree with them. So if you kind of could just explain, like, kind of that essentially, like why it's important in order for you to critique or to know how something functions, you actually have to study it, like kind of just like lay that out and how it probably ties in with the dialectical materialist analysis.
Because if you don't know what you don't know, like you can't have smoke for something that you don't know about. I don't know what else to say about it. It's like you don't know. If you never read even the Communist Manifesto, how can you possibly have anything to say about Marxism? And do I think that you need to go be like Karl Marx and go to the library and bury yourself and be covered in boils and all that stuff? No, I don't think that, but I do think you need to have some sense of what is being said beyond tweets and think pieces. I just believe that. I believe that to be true. And part of being in an organization is that you don't have to do that work alone, right? That's the point of collective study. It's coming to a common understanding and understanding things together. And so I just think ignorance is no excuse. And there's all there's this weird position that reading is elite or study is elite, that people don't have time. But most people I know watch a lot of Netflix, or they watch a lot of sports, or they read a lot of magazines. That's time, right? And you don't have, and you even just reading 10 or 20 minutes a day, or even listening to podcasts, right? Like listening to audiobooks. That's just an evasion of responsibility that I just don't agree with. And I'm not saying that as an academic, because there's a lot of academics who are ignorant. And a lot of academics don't even read. I'm saying that as somebody who came to consciousness, as somebody who was revolutionized through study and through reading, right? Like that is it real, it's really, really important. And I just don't know. I don't understand why that's controversial. Yeah, you can go to your local library. Like, it's like, okay, well, people can't afford books. Go to your local library. You have a smartphone. You have a phone, read on the internet.
I speak as someone who is like trained to be a librarian. Like we exist. Just come to us. We don't have, we'll let you know. So
yeah. So I just think, and everybody's gonna have a different everybody's gonna have a different level of understanding and all those things. And I think that's okay. Because it's not about mastery in the sense of like being able to regurgitate or being able to have the correct language. It's about like, how do you understand what's going on around you and what are you going to do about it? That's the point, I think.
Facts. Yeah, so we definitely appreciate you having you here. I guess before you go, if you want to plug in anything, and for those listening, I know she gave me the credit for like a GOAT page or whatever, but her page was a Black Left Stacks.
Black Left AF Stacks.
Yeah, it supersedes my page, trust me. Her stacks is on point. So just wanted to plug that in. But if there's anything you want to plug in before we head on out and let you go, the floor is yours.
I'm speaking of stacks, I have a lot of books. So I'm about to just hold up some books that people that are sort of important to this conversation we've had. So here's one, How We Get Free, Black Feminism in the Combahee River Collected, edited by Kianga Yamada Taylor. We got Cheryl Higashida, Black Internationalist Feminism, Women Writers of the Black Left, 1945 to 1995. This one here. We got Radicalism at the Crossroads, African-American Women Activists in the Cold War by Dale Gore here. We got Left of Karl Marx, the Bible, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones by CBD. Shout out to CBD. Carol Boyce Davies. Ashley D. Farmer, another homie, Remaking Black Power, How Black Women Transformed an Era. There's a lot in here about Queen Mother Moore. Andaye, The Point is to Change the World. I think I mentioned her. Amazing, underrated thinker. She was a comrade of Walter Rodney and the Working People's Alliance. This is The War Before, the true life story of becoming a Black Panther, keeping the faith in prison and fighting those left behind by Sophia Bukhari. Shout out to Dev Springer for putting me on to this. I got more, get comfortable. So this book is The Cancer of Colonialism, W. Alpheus Hunton, Black Liberation and the Daily Worker, 1944 to 1946. So this is really, So okay, just side note, one of the women that I'm very interested in is named Dorothy Hunton, and there's like almost nothing about her, but she did write the only biography of William Alpheus Hunton because she was his third wife. But so much, the second book I'm writing is about something called mutual comradeship. And one aspect of that is that like, there's a lot of women working alongside the men. So the men might publish it, but they're discussing these ideas, refining these ideas with their partner, their romantic partners who are also like their comrades, along with people in their org. So like, I read everything I read of Alpheus after a certain moment. I also know that Dorothy's in there. Okay, anyway. So Pan-Africanism and Communism, the Communist International, Africa and the Diaspora, 1919 and 1939 by Hakeem Adi, big homie Hakeem. He just came out with another book too recently. I really love this book, Winnie Mandela, Part of My Soul Went With Him. This one. Just a few more, y'all. Obviously, autobiography of Angela Davis. You can think whatever you want to think about Angela Davis now, but this is a really important book about organizing, because Angela Davis will be rotting under the jail right now if it was not for the Communist Party organizing and the internationalization of her campaign. It was not like, it basically was at that time, the modern day like Scottsboro trial. They really, really organized and galvanized people around her freedom, and they won. Asada, obviously an autobiography. James and Esther Cooper Jackson, Love and Courage in the Black Freedom Movement. Esther Cooper Jackson is still alive today. We got Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois. This is the only full-length biography of Shirley Graham by the actual GOATs, Gerald Horne, one of my great friends and mentors. This is the other Bible, Sojourning for Freedom, Black Women, American Communism, and the Making of the Black Left. This book changed my life. Seriously, like this book changed the trajectory of my studies, seriously. This one, Louise Thompson Patterson, A Life of Struggle for Justice by Keith Gilliard. Interestingly, I found out last time I was in New York, I met with Mary Louise Patterson, who's the daughter of Louise Thompson Patterson and William Patterson, that she actually asked Keith Gilliard to write this book because in the 1980s, so I'm working on an article about this right now, but anyway, in the 1980s, they were working on her memoir. Like there was a whole bunch of people around it. They were raising money, all this stuff around doing a memoir that never came to fruition. And so finally, Louise Thompson Patterson asked Keith Gilliard to do it. Only 3 more, y'all. Okay, Tyra J. Edwards, Black activist in the in the global freedom struggle. This Tyra Edwards is somebody that we feature in Organized Fight Win. You got Eslanda, The Large and Unconventional Life of Mrs. Paul Robeson. Now, this is the Yale University copy, but another edition just recently came out with Haymarket, and it's way cheaper. Same book. And then we got Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry by Imani Perry. There's been 3 biographies that came out about her recently. This one is my favorite. So that's what I got to plug. Books, read Hood Communist, read Black Agenda Report, join and contribute to an organization, and Pessimism of the Intellect, Optimism of the Will. That's it.
Bars. Well, yeah, thank you again. We appreciate you joining us, taking time out. I know you're a very busy person, so we definitely appreciate it. Before we go, we also want to plug in our podcast. Before that, definitely try to copy some. You can't get this, so I'm not trying to be like bougie and nothing, but like this is actually like internal party stuff. But we got stuff on our site, on the Etsy shop. It's going to be in our bio for sure. You also have obviously the Forward Ever podcast as well, which is on Spotify. We have our main YouTube page, the Southwest chapter, which is formerly known as the New Mexico chapter, with our comrade, as she was saying, Onyisanwu, and other comrades there in the Southwest chapter. And we also have the Revolutionary African Women's podcast. And then we also have our Ancestors' Voices, which is done by our comrade, Ajamu, and his lovely daughter, Shakira. That's done on, I think, every Sundays at 7. So, yeah, definitely join the organization if you haven't gotten that theme already from this episode. But yeah, we once again thank you, Dr. CBS. Appreciate you having you on, and Forward Ever.
No compromise, no retreat. Bye, y'all.
Yeah.
All right.